Honey, I'm confused. I don't know what anything in tango is. And I know anytime anybody has ever asked a question about tango, you've always seemed to be at the ready with an opinion. So whether that's an answer or just your musings, I figure maybe I could find out more about some topics that are very ambiguous in tango. And so to the extent that I don't understand them, you can clue me in on how to think about it. And then I can disagree. About that.
That sounds...
So to give you an example of what I'm talking about, something like the Capaseo. So commonly misunderstood or debated, right?
I think there's two main camps. On the one side are the purists who are saying it needs to be this way because it's always been this way, and if we don't preserve the tradition of it, then what's going to happen, and it's all going to go to shit, whatever, you know? And on the other side are people who are coming into tango from other dance forms or who are American, and they're kind of like, you're going to make me jump through these hoops? Like, what the hell? Why? Why
So
can't I just,
does
like,
it feel
come
exclusively American?
Well, I guess I think it's, I don't know if it's exclusively American, but I do feel like when I hear complaints about Americans by other people from other countries, which I hear a lot of that. They'll say, like, Americans are like this, and in America, people don't have very close friendships, or like don't bond the same way as in other countries, and people don't care about their families the same way, and they'll have like this criticism. So I've heard criticism about Americans in terms of their non-conformity to the standards that we see in Buenos Aires. Like in American milongas, they don't care. Like that's the sentiment. Like American dancers don't really care to go through the Capaseo because Americans don't value their tradition and history. They just want to throw it out and go with the modern stuff. Like that's something that's kind of a common thing I hear about Americans. And so, I gotta say, you know,
it sounds like there's an argument for keeping the Capaseo as it's understood today, generally, out of a sense of tradition, versus I would argue Capaseo is great because of how it sort of is a egoless or a ego-saving way for a person to ask for a dance.
I mean, you might say that, of course.
We get to the same end point, but through a different appeal.
Right, but very rightly so. Somebody might argue, well then, if it doesn't matter, why can't I just do it my way? Like, if ultimately what you're saying is that you don't want my ego to be hurt, and you're giving me the easier way of, like, not getting my ego hurt, and I can say, well, I actually then prefer asking someone. Like, you can't argue with that. It, like, makes sense.
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of things, like practically speaking, for somebody who's coming in from a different dance form where they're used to making eye contact and coming up to someone and extending their hand, to them it's like, why can't I do that? That's so strange, right?
Yeah.
So I understand both sides. And I don't think there will ever be a truce between the two sides. I mean, there is an us versus them in tango. There's an us versus them in art. And maybe that's because I really got sucked into that whole paradox in art, and it caused me a lot of suffering because I didn't understand why certain things were working the way they did. In tango, it doesn't really bother me as much. Like, I'm okay with the fact that that's how people are. Yep. I'm okay with the fact that sometimes somebody's gonna come up and ask me to dance. Like, it doesn't offend me. It doesn't offend my, sense of self, I'm also okay with saying no.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I'm like, I enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, oh,
Saying no.
yeah, totally. I'm like, oh, you think you can do that? You think you can like bypass the rule of Capistean and ask me because you think I'm not going to say no? Like, because for some guys, I think sometimes I think people don't want to obey the rule of Capisteus because they don't want to be rejected. Because it is much harder to say no to somebody eye to eye verbally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think guys know that. So
Oh.
if they come up to a woman and they start chatting her up and they engage her in a conversation, it's very, reasonable for them to think that that's a great way to secure their ego and not get rejected. Because it's going to be much less likely that she's going to say no after that.
I mean, I hadn't really thought of it that way, but that is brilliant. I mean, it is kind of like, young men out there. Yeah, good point. Like, if you're good with that, you kind of, could deal with having a conversation, as you put it. Like, I think you defend your point very well. But, guys, like, consider that it might be less likely in America, let's say, in the States, that she'll reject because she doesn't want to. So, should you go ahead and ignore Capaseo and just straight up ask? Because if there's some probability that she's not going to say no out of, some cultural force that she's grown up with that says, I just don't want to make things uncomfortable, sure, then you will get dances. Now, will she harbor that into the dance? Maybe that's something you can work on. If you can wow her, great. But it would, statistically speaking, be a pretty smart approach. I think actually now as I'm thinking about it, to just straight up ask if your thing is you just want dances.
Right, and that's like a very American way of thinking.
It is.
It's a very American
because I'm
way
thinking
of thinking.
I'm thinking of the judgment I have on myself as a younger man, where I was like, bro, don't you see how this is done? Just go out there and ask every chick at the bar, yo, so you come here often? I mean, that's what went through my head as a younger man, and even now that it takes different forms, but yo, why don't you just ask for what you want more? Just do it, because there is a very American mentality that will produce dividends. That's what you need to do to be successful in other ways. And so if you define success as getting many dances at a Malanga, then yes, that would be the approach to take.
Right. And I mean, I think it's also a mistake to just only think of this as American, because that's how people think of it. They think it's an American way of thinking through the problem, but it happens everywhere. It exists in Buenos Aires to the same degree, I think, that some people are thinking about it very practically. If you have a milonguero who is not very attractive and he's older and he's fat and he's coming to a milonga and he wants to dance with these, young foreigners who are coming in, which I was, they're going to do everything they can to score. And they are going to overstep their boundaries if they feel that they need to. So it's kind of like what I accepted as a reality of humanity. That's how people think, because they're there to enjoy themselves. They're thinking about themselves first.
Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, the most misunderstood topics are the ones where there's two very clearly delineated camps.
Yeah.
So Capaseo maybe wasn't the worst one to bring up, but another one that I was thinking of was the idea of dissociation.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this the other day, and I thought, okay, yeah, well, first, let me just define what dissociation is. And then as I was thinking through it, and I thought through it in very physical terms, so thinking about, to the extent that I understand things like force and vectors, like the directions of those force, and remember physics problems in high school or college where you'd always have that N. I don't know what N is, but it would point up against like the thing that was pointing against.
I don't remember any of that, but
And
go ahead.
and it quickly got me to the place where I was like, oh yeah, what is dissociation? 'Cause that's not helping me at all. But why do you think that dissociation is hard for people to understand, or why it's a common source of confusion for people when it's discussed?
Yeah. Well, okay. First of all, the word itself is pretty confusing.
Is it dissociation or is it disassociation?
I know, exactly.
I actually I asked ChatGPT.
And it said it was the same thing. It's the same thing. Yeah, it's like so, it's so confusing. And that word is not a good word to use because in commonly understood language, it's like a negative thing. Like I dissociated from my body,
right.
Like that kind of dissociative qualities of somebody's mental state or something.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first level of confusion. The second level of confusion is it's taught as part of pivoting technique. It's the way I learned it, and this is something I'd love to hear from our listeners because I'm curious if that's just me or that's how commonly people learn this concept. But the way I was taught, it's like when you do ochos, you dissociate. In order to do ochos, you dissociate, right? And dissociation is this twist of your chest, this like twisting towards your partner to produce a pivot on one foot. And so in my mind, dissociation existed as like the way warrior pose does. It's like dissociation means this, and I'm just twisting my chest, right? It's
in
like,
warrior pose?
No, I'm saying like the way warrior pose exists in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what is warrior pose? Oh, it's this. And so it's like, oh, what is dissociation? Oh, it's this. It's like this is this pose. Like think of dissociation as a pose.
Oh.
That's how I learned it, is what I'm saying. That's how I understood it.
I think I understand. Like, it's not a concept that describes how you move through space, but rather it's
like this thing that I do.
State.
Yeah.
That you
like you dissociate, you do this
body.
shape. You do this shape called dissociation.
I see.
And you dissociate to produce this thing called the ocho. That's kind of how like it got conceptualized in my mind, and it was a very limited concept.
Yeah, I don't imagine you still.
No, it doesn't make sense.
It sounds,
right, it doesn't make sense. But that's how it was taught, I would say. That's how it was explained. A lot of times when the teachers are talking about dissociation, they're showing it, and they're saying, when I step here, I turn my chest here, and that's dissociation.
Gotcha.
And so in your mind, you're like, okay, I step and I do this,
left
and that's
foot forward,
yeah.
right shoulder
back.
meets it.
Right shoulder, exactly. Right shoulder meets it, exactly.
Right.
That's a great. I'm glad you pointed that out because that's another instruction. It's like when you're learning to dissociate, which is like that's no such thing. We dissociate, like that's built into our body.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have to learn it.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, when we start focusing on it, we do some weird stuff with our gait. Like people start walking unilaterally,
Mm-hmm.
And so the teachers will often say...
Oh, that beginner tango walk.
Right, like, and... So,
never have people so quickly forgotten how to do something they've been doing every day for the last
I know, it's
20 years.
All of a sudden you're thinking about walking, and you're like, what is this thing called feet? Like, your left foot. No, your left foot. Your left... it's weird.
Yeah.
So, so they'll say, dissociate. When you walk, you dissociate. You put your left shoulder and your right foot, or your left foot and your right shoulder, and you'll learn opposition. Like words like opposition come in as well, which is a better word, I think. Anyway, so it was a very confusing concept. I didn't really understand the purpose of it, and I eventually, there were two things that helped me finally turn a corner.
Mm-hmm.
One was just studying other dance forms that did not use such a word as dissociation. It wasn't part of their dance, but they had similar movements.
Mm-hmm.
And so I learned other ways of describing the same actions, and then was
Gotcha.
like, oh, okay, like that. There's the overlap. There's like an overlap in mechanics.
Yeah, because it doesn't seem like tango should have a lock or a patent on something like dissociation, which
right.
according to ChatGPT was some sort of isolation of one part of the body versus movement of another one in order to create dynamism.
Right, exactly.
Is that
so that was the number two thing that happened was when I was in Buenos Aires, I heard a teacher, Mariana Dragone, with whom I studied a lot. She said that dissociation is just dissociating one part from another. So I can dissociate anything in my body.
Mm-hmm.
If my arm goes opposite direction from my chest, I'm dissociating my arm from my chest.
Mm-hmm.
And if I turn my head away from where my chest is leaning, I'm dissociating my head.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, okay. So what's happening here is you're actively trying to create opposition.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're pivoting, you need that.
Mm-hmm.
So you're winding up your body in a way that would produce momentum for you to pivot.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like there's this aesthetic or some sort of a requirement for you to dissociate when you do an ocho. It's a byproduct of needing to do something specific, like to produce momentum so you make it around the body. So it's very much of an effect.
Yeah.
With tango, you're using the same types of forces. When you dissociate, you build up some sort of a recoiling action.
Mm-hmm.
So everything in tango is meant to produce this state of going around your partner effortlessly with the exact amount of energy you need to do it without any tension, right? And so you're using all these ways to produce that from within your body and feed off your partner's body, because your partner's dissociating as well. And that's one of the things that when I was in Buenos Aires for 6 months, like that was the thing worked on in every class. Every class they were trying to explain to us how the torquing up of the partner's spine produced something in their partner. That it wasn't like a pattern. It wasn't that like, oh, when I step here, you step here. It was like you have to learn to feel in your partner's body that winding up action, which we call dissociation. But unfortunately, it's such a strange concept. It's kind of hard to get at it from multiple directions at once, because when beginners coming in, they can't tell their left from their right a lot of times. So you have to really simplify and give it in small bits. I think the problem becomes that somebody might come and they take like a series. Let's say they do a series for a few months or a year, and then they stop taking classes, and then their conception of what this technique is stays at that level. And so when they end up going into higher level classes or dancing with somebody who has more understanding of the technique, there's this like gap of understanding.
That's the single best reason to take classes throughout your dancing experience. And I don't take classes that often, but what you just said reminds me that that's why it is valuable. Whether or not you think you're gonna, learn a new pattern and be able to retain it, what you often find in classes, like at festivals, is that the teachers have thought through these things in their own way, very deeply, and they'll provide you with some perspective that might be different from the perspective that you already have. And in that way, you become a more robust, maybe not a more robust dancer, but you can be more robust in your thinking through concepts in a way where you can identify these concepts in your dance more clearly. And then if you choose to work on them, or you want to change them in any way, you can do so through your own process and efforts.
Yeah, and I would hope so. I really do want that to be the case. I don't know if it is like that right now, because the problem with festivals is that the teachers end up teaching stuff that's way too advanced. They're teaching to a level of certain, because people are not interested otherwise. Like a lot of times people go to festivals and they want to learn a cool pattern.
Oh yeah,
or
yeah,
something,
for sure.
you know?
I totally agree with that. Like there is a
So
part of me
there's
that's
a
just
little
like
bit of like,
it's you can't market a class as
Yeah.
like back to basics. I'm just
right, like
kind of
if
not.
you just do a class on dissociation, like if every festival, had a minimum requirement, like if you're going to sign up for classes, make sure that you take this class, and it just covers some of the higher technique of fundamentals. You know, like let's just go through and make sure you understand Molinete technique, just concepts like dissociation, axis, how to tell if your partner's balanced, technique for
Right.
dancing and
I
heels,
can
like
immediately
whatever.
see the problem in a festival
Right.
setting. How do you make
Yeah.
sure that everybody
Exactly.
gets value from that class, whether they're beginner, intermediate, advanced?
Right, and the people who really need to
dancer.
take that class are not going to. And the people who actually don't need to take that class, they're going to, because those are the people who are like so studious, and they're so like I'm going to give it all my all, and they're the ones who always think that they're not good enough. But the people who actually need to take that class, they think they don't need it. So how do you get those people to realize that? You know, that's why dissociation is such a strange concept, because most people think they understand it. They think they don't need to,
Yeah.
like, it's just like, oh, I get it. Or they don't even understand it to the most basic level, so they don't even like ask about it. If they hear it in class, they're like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, I know.
Yeah.
That's how I was for a long time.
I guess I wouldn't, unless I was at some festival that very much felt like a vacation, where I thought, just doing a little class. I could see it as like almost like a yoga session, getting ready for some dancing later on. But
Yeah, I've
otherwise,
actually,
I always feel like it's work. Like
Yeah,
I need to feel like classes are more like my morning yoga session, and that way I might be more interested in taking them.
totally.
Well, I guess we figured it. We figured out
Cabaseo
and dissociation.
I want to finish with a concept that I remember being very confusing at the beginning for me as a follower, and also for my partner at the time. And that was the concept of embrace and what the embrace is supposed to be like. I think there's a lot of ambiguity and confusion when people first start. Whether
Are you talking about like what the like to think of like the wrappiness of the embrace, or whether the embrace should be close versus open?
all of that. So like what defines an open embrace? What is a close embrace? What's the in-between embrace? Because sometimes there's this
That feels more difficult, because is an open embrace one with space, close embrace one where there's touching of the chests, and then anything between would be the more like, well, how much space?
Well, exactly. And that's, I think, a lot of times what is the correct way becomes the question, because some dancers, they'll hear teachers say something like, oh, it's got to be like a V, where, that your partner's chest and your chest kind of make a V together.
Right.
Versus some teachers will say it really needs to be chest to chest.
Right.
It's a very, maybe it's an easy concept to understand once you've done it for a bit. And I think the big reveal for me in tango came when I just really came back to this principle, which again it's an art principle that I sort of superimpose onto tango, and I mentioned it recently, called form follows function. This idea of form follows function. And when I understood what that meant in tango, that whatever external form that happens to be in your body needs to be coming from the function, from what you're doing. It's not some sort of like rule out there in the ethers where somebody says, oh, the embrace must be this way or it must be that way. there are artificial structures called tango history and style history and our sort of conventions that we've created that have dictated certain things about the embrace. But ultimately, the embrace really needs to be informed by what you're trying to do in your dance, right? So very simply, does it need to be open embrace or does it need to be close embrace? The question is, what's your goal here, right? Ultimately, is your goal to be dancing in a very tight space with lots and lots of people and traffic? Right. Then close embrace. Yeah. Is your goal to learn all of the permutations of staccatas and really interesting sequences with breaking the embrace and like super nuevo stuff? Well, then you need to use open embrace. And I think,
and I imagine you can be in close embrace, but in order to do some things that you might want to do in nuevo, that embrace probably has to open in order to allow the feet to have enough space to do what they need to do for what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
So that's where the form is dictated by the function, i.e. where you want to actually step or what kind of dynamism you want to create in the dance. The form will follow from that.
Right. And it's a very liberating thought, but also
exactly, knowing... and it feels like one of those thoughts. It's like very much like you tell that to somebody who's trying to learn, and actually they need to start at the other end of the spectrum. Right. It's like, oh, okay, here's the form, and this form will allow you to do that thing that you want to do, because the way you've probably come to realize what it is you want to learn is through observing others and going, oh, I want to do what Chicho does.
Correct.
And so, okay.
Yeah.
That's the role of the teacher then, to take the function and explain how that helps the form.
Right, because if you understand the function, then your possibilities are endless. You can say, look at the function. What are you trying to do? When somebody's like really struggling and they're like, where does my foot need to be and where does this go? And they're like so thinking about all these details. I just say, where are you trying to go? Where's your body naturally going? It's like that moment when we start thinking about walking and all of a sudden we can't walk.
Yeah.
But then you're like, okay, forget what you're walking and just look what you're going. So if you're walking, you're just go where you're going and the walking will happen.
Right.
So there's a certain process in tango that starts to take place with the embrace the same way, where it's like, don't think about the specifics of what the embrace needs to be. Think about what is it that you're trying to do.
Yeah, it would feel like you would, in that process, you would put the student's foot where it needs to go, and then you would have them place their arms in a way that would still work within the embrace.
Possibly.
And then that would be the idea behind, you're starting too much from, well, what do I do? And you're thinking about the embrace and the form you need to take. But instead, let's think about the function, a step. So think about the way I keep it clear now is, it's almost like the foot is the function, i.e. where do I need to step? Where do I need to go? And the form is the embrace or the upper part of the body, which is what it looks like when you're dancing.
Yeah, the embrace follows the foot.
Easily explained concepts.
I love that. No, it's true. And I think I have to qualify this because I don't think anybody will disagree with what we just said, but I do think when you're dealing with stage dancing and dancers who are professional, who are developing their style to be recognized on stage or competing in championships, they will be learning tango from this kind of a different perspective where it's not necessarily about the function as much as it is about the form, where like the function is really pushed to serve the form, right? And they want to be as flamboyant, as big as they possibly can. So if somebody goes to a class with someone like that, they will tell you the embrace must be like this. They'll use those words. And so if people are not careful, they hear that and they're like, oh, this person says it must be like that. And this other person says it cannot be like that. So then there's this confusion. But I think when we realize like there's just two dances called social tango,
Right.
and then there's stage tango. And
Yeah.
for social tango, the function of social tango is to be able to dance with lots of people in the same space for many hours. So then it informs us how we're going to dance, like right, how we're going to express our dance, because it needs to fit into small spaces.
Yeah.
So it's
totally clear now.
Yeah, I'm so glad. I'm so glad.
I guess maybe next time we have to have really, really difficult concepts in tango and how they're misunderstood.
I'm curious how this is actually landing for our listeners, because maybe for some of them, there's some other themes that were really difficult or still are really confusing, like concepts like grounding, for example. I hear that a lot in class. It's like, what does it mean to ground, or moving from the center? Like, there's a lot of these concepts that just get thrown around and people hear a lot, but when they like take a moment and think about it, they actually don't know what they mean. So if you do have a concept like that you'd like to share, go ahead and pop it into the comments below. And also you can do that on Spotify or YouTube. So we'd love to hear from you. All right. That was a good one, yeah?
Yeah, let's get on with the rest of our day.
Yeah, so we'll see you next time on the next Tango Banter. Ciao.